Date night? Are you kidding? Henry, was talking to a couple about their marriage and suggested that they should consider having a date night. When I did, the wife just rolled her eyes and said, "That will never work. I'm not going." She seemed a bit closed-minded to me, so I asked, "Why not?" Immediately she said, "Because he will just be like this the whole time." She then mimicked him being on his phone, typing away, sending a text message or an email. "That would be a horrible way to spend an evening," she went on. "Now you can always be found, which means you are on call 24/7. Anyone, anytime, anywhere, and for any reason can get to you. Feeling a bit exposed? You should, because you are. Choosing freedom, avoiding destruction." Technology and social media aren't inherently bad. In fact, there are many ways that they can enhance your life and relationships. But just as it is with so many other things in life, it's important to make sure you are controlling your digital life so it doesn't control you. That's where boundaries come in. Remember, boundaries exist to define a property line. They define what is yours and what is not yours. They are like a fence, but with a gate. You can open or close the gate and let people in or keep them out as you choose. The challenge comes in deciding what your gate policy is going to be for your digital life. How will you decide when to open the gate and when to keep it tightly shut? These are often challenging decisions to make, and not everyone agrees on how to make them. A reality I faced head on a few years ago when two of my daughters were in middle school. Social media drama. Henry's daughters were in middle school as social media was really heating up. They had Instagram accounts and used them to keep up with extended family, grandparents, cousins, and close friends. They loved it, and I loved how they used social media to share life with people they were close to. But then Lucy came home from school one day very upset. The school had a new principal, for whom I had much respect and still do, who had laid down a new law. No one at the school was allowed to have a social media account. Yes, you read that right. He did not say they were not allowed to use a social media account at school. He said that they were not allowed to have one at all, even for use away from school. They were strictly prohibited from using social media, period, anytime or anywhere. I was incensed. This new policy seemed to be extreme overreach. I felt like middle school was the perfect time for kids to learn how to use social media responsibly, because they could still be closely monitored by parents and teachers. By the time they were in high school and free to use it without any supervision, we would have missed these valuable training years. By banning social media, the school was skipping over a necessary preparation period, the equivalent of the driver's permit stage before getting a license. That's what seemed like overreach, that the school was inserting itself into students' personal lives in a way that had no right to do. How could they think it was okay to keep students from communicating with extended family like grandparents and cousins? Were we living in a communist country? I was opposed to the policy for psychological and developmental reasons, brain and neurological self-control building reasons, parenting and family reasons, community reasons, and for that, what I'll call government intrusion reasons. So I did something I have never done. I set up a meeting with the principal to discuss his decision. I prepared by doing research, talking with experienced youth workers, and also talking to the president of a national association of Christian schools, all of whom reinforced my own thinking. When I met the principal, I presented all the parenting, psychological, neurological, and other reasons I thought this was an overreach and bad for the kids. I could totally understand a rule of no phones or social media use at school, but a student's private life activities was the domain of parents. The principal's perspective was basically this: when students have a social media account, so much drama is created within their relationships after hours that the next day at school is negatively affected by whatever happened the day or evening before. The school did not want to deal with the interference, so they were going to stick to their zero tolerance policy. My position was the very reason not to have the policy. If kids were misbehaving in a way that should be disciplined and trained, then the school's role was to do that effectively. This was not only their job, but also a great opportunity to teach these soon-to-be high schoolers how to handle technology and social media responsibly before they had more freedom. Otherwise, students would have no preparation and no training before being launched into total social media freedom in just a few couple years. In response to the argument that the kids' brains were not developed enough to handle it, I pointed out the scientific reality that self-control in the brain is developed in the context of observing, supportive training, and corrective relationships, precisely the kind of relationships they had with teachers. Didn't parents want help inputting self-control into those budding brains? The principal still said no. He did not want to have to deal with the repercussions at school from what happened in students' social media lives. The boundary gate was shut and tightly locked. I disagreed with his decision then, and I still do. I don't think these kinds of rules work. They might shut out some drama, but they do not develop mature kids. Maturity comes from having choices and having to exercise them well or lose them. The Apostle Paul acknowledged a similar principle when he instructed the church at Colossae not to submit themselves to strict rule about food and drink. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with us, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Some regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgences. Colossians 2, verse 21. See verses 16 through 23. However, I also understood that there was a legitimate reason the principal felt the way he did. Using the Colossians passage as an example, he might say that even though we don't have to submit to rules about what we eat or drink, because such rules do not produce maturity, it is still true that drinking or eating responsibly can be very destructive. In fact, it can kill you. And by extension, kids using social media irresponsibly can kill their day at school. The principal was doing what many of us sometimes do to defend against a lack of maturity or self-control in a few, which is to make strict rules against any and all forms of whatever is causing problems. Whether that be food, drink, entertainment, the opposite sex, dating, or whatever area of life presents a possible negative outcome, including technology. Keep the good in and the bad out. Whatever the context, boundaries are about freedom. self-control, responsibility, and love. At the same time, freedom should never be used to harm yourself or anyone else. We are called to be free, but with this caution. Do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Galatians 5 verse 13. This is the principle. You are free, and your boundaries are meant to protect that freedom. But do not use your freedom to hurt anyone, yourself, or anyone else. Use your freedom to love. And that brings us to boundaries and your use of technology. You are certainly free to use it, but you must not allow freedom to bring about destruction to you or anyone else. This is what boundaries are for, to keep the good in your life and the bad out of your life. One way to do this, to make sure you are using technology rather than allowing it to use you, is to follow a principle Jesus demonstrated in observing the Sabbath. God had given the Sabbath to the ancient Israelites after they were freed from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. The Sabbath put a boundary on how much time God's people spent on work so that they could devote one day a week to rest and worship. The Sabbath was a gift intended for the good of the people. Unfortunately, what started out as a gift for good over time degenerated into a rigid rule, one that sometimes burdened rather than blessed. When Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, the religious leaders accused him of wrongdoing. They felt he had violated the Sabbath by doing work. His reply was simply and to the point, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill. Mark 3 verse 4. On another occasion, he summarized the principle this way: the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. Mark 2 verses 27. In other words, like all healthy boundaries, the rule about Sabbath observance was meant to serve us, to keep us safe, and to enhance our life with God by giving Him first priority. Here's the point. Adhering to structures, boundaries, or rules can be very beneficial, but rules in and of themselves should not be your mastery, robbing you of the freedom to do good for others or yourself. That is why I like to say it this way: find the misery and make a rule. If there is an area of your life in which you are suffering, make a personal rule to keep it from hurting you. If you get a stomach ache and break out in a rash every time you eat a certain food, then make a rule that you will stay away from that food. Just as an alcoholic cannot ever have a sip of wine, you just can't eat that food. And the same thing applies to setting boundaries on technology and social media. If it's intruding on your life, relationships, make a rule to protect yourself. In my own life, I, Henry, found early on that I was allowing work-related email and writing books to intrude too much into my personal and family time. So I made a rule: no work email at night and no writing at home. Another rule was we have at home no use of cell phones or other devices by anyone during family dinners. Why? We are trying to preserve that time and space for family connectedness. Do I occasionally take a call, send a message, or look something up? Of course. At that point, I heal on the Sabbath. But as a general rule, no. Here's another example of finding the misery in making a rule. My work requires a fair amount of travel and speaking engagements, so I was concerned when I realized I was beginning to dread speaking trips. It wasn't the speaking itself that I dreaded. it was all the extra meetings, dinner, and activities the organizers wanted to add around the event. They were all very good things, but my schedule would get so jammed I couldn't focus on what I was there to do. Speak and deliver content well. So I made a rule: no meeting or other activities around a speaking event. Do I sometimes break that rule? Absolutely. But having the rule protects me from the misery, and I no longer dread speaking trips. Again, the principle is that when something is causing you or others some kind of pain, find the misery and make a rule. Preserve the good stuff and prevent the bad stuff. This is what boundaries are all about. Here are just a few examples of how people have put this principle into action with technology and social media. Phones are routinely turned off and put away during important relationship times. For example, family dinners, date nights, social gatherings, and conversations with friends. Email and social media are turned off during important work periods or other times that require sustained focus, productivity, and task completion. Social media engagement is limited to certain time blocks, for example, 15 minutes once or twice a day. No technology is used 30 minutes before going to bed at night and 30 minutes after getting up in the morning. You may find that personal rules such as these not only prevent a lot of misery, but they can allow you to get more done. For example, when I am writing, I turned off my email to limit distractions. Studies have shown that when engaged in a project that requires deep thought, being interrupted by distractions such as email can cost up to 20 minutes of productivity. At other times, you might find that having access actually saves you time and energy. For example, if I'm on a call for an urgent issue that will need my attention the second it comes through, having my phone on during a meeting actually makes it possible for me to focus better because I don't have to get up at various intervals to call the office and check on the status of things. My office or answering service can easily reach me when necessary. It's like having a fire alarm. As long as it's not going off, you do not have to wonder whether the building is on fire. So the point here is to be in control in a way that serves you, your relationships, your life, your mission, or whatever your objectives may be. There are no absolute rules about technology, but we can have helpful rules for ourselves. As I write this, I have just come from a 3-hour family meeting where we are planning out our next year, dividing up duties, and took care of a lot of issues. When the meeting began, I said to the kids, "No phones, turn them off, it helps."